December 25th come to be associated with Jesus' birthday? Well, first of all, the Bible offers few clues, if any. There's no dating. Okay? What we're talking about are celebrations or festivities, how they have come to be manifest in history. Dates are not given in the New Testament, not even the time of year. Now, I know in one of the versions of the Christmas story it said that shepherds were out tending their flocks. All right? But most scholars would say, those stories were meant to be theological. Don't spend a lot of time trying to find a minute detail which really doesn't matter. But if you want to go along with it, the tending of the sheep is usually in lambing season, which would be in the spring. Okay, but we're not gonna go there, and not in any serious way. Now, extra biblical evidence. Sources from outside the Bible about these festivals is very sparse. There's no mention of birth celebrations in the early church. Writers like St. Irenaeus and Tertullian in the middle of the first century. No mention of birthday celebrations. In fact, the theologian Origen in the mid-200s came out and he mocked the Roman festivities, the pagan festivities. All right, and so of the Roman festivities of celebrating famous births. So obviously, if a theologian like Origen would come out and say that, it's a good chance that the Christians were not celebrating Christmas at this point. But one of the things we have to remember, and it becomes the key later on, the focus, as we'll see later on, and what is more celebrated, is the death of Jesus. The Gospels provide pretty detailed information as to the time of Jesus' death. And today, we have 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And of the 4, the gospel that seems to be most used to understand when Jesus was crucified is John's gospel. John has Jesus crucified the day before Passover, the 14th day of Nisan, when the sheep was slaughtered. So the idea was in John, when Jesus dies on the cross, was the time of day that the sheep, the lambs, were being slaughtered, getting prepared for Passover. So Easter became for Christians a reinterpretation of Passover in terms of Jesus' passion. That's how the Easter event kind of grew. Easter was definitely a Christian feast by the mid-2nd century. Right. But over time, Jesus' origins would become a concern. Now, what is very interesting in the Gospels and in Paul's epistles, the earliest writings in the Gospels, the epistles of Paul, the Gospel of Mark, have no mention of the birth of Jesus. Matthew and Mark have 2 nativity stories, what we call infancy narratives. Totally distinct, totally different. What we've done in the modern age, in literature and in art, we've tended to combine the 2 stories of Matthew and of Luke, but they're totally different. The emphases are totally different. One emphasizes Joseph, one emphasizes Mary. Okay? And, that's we can talk about that later on. But there are no dates given in any of these. In the 2nd century, we find details about Jesus' birth and his young life in the scriptures that are called apocryphal. In other words, they're not accepted in the true canon of the scriptures of Christianity. So we find that, for example, there's an infancy gospel of Thomas, and there's a proto-gospel of James. And in these gospels, which are outside the canon of the scriptures, there are all these stories and information about Jesus' birth and his younger life and details and so on and so forth. But still, no date is ever given. In about 200, we jump to Northern Africa. Now, Northern Africa had a certain influence in the early church. There is a reference that there was a Christian teacher in Egypt who was talking about the dates that the North African Christians were using to talk about the day when Jesus was born. They were all based upon the Egyptian calendar, so don't ask me any questions about that. I haven't a clue as to what the Egyptian calendar looks like. But I do know they were all set in April, May, or June, what we would in our calendar. So you begin to see the development of dates in around the year 200 in Northern Africa. In the late 2nd century, the 100s, there becomes more and more of an interest in dating the day of the birth. By the 4th century, now the 4th century was the century that Constantine was converted to Christianity. All right. But by the 4th century, there were references to when the Nativity was celebrated. Interestingly enough, one was December 25th in the West and January 6th in the East. Okay? And we're all familiar with Christmas on December 25th and the Feast of the Epiphany on January 6th. Okay? Now, there's all sorts of symbolism that are connected with that and the 12 days of Christmas in between. We can talk about that too a little bit later. So the earliest mention of December 25th comes from an almanac, a Roman almanac. And the first item in this almanac stated that Jesus of Nazareth was born on December 25th. Now, there was a group in Northern Africa who were heretics, right? And St. Augustine tried to fight them. They were very traditionalists. And one of the things that they did, they refused, they claimed Christ was born on December 25th, but they wouldn't celebrate the Epiphany because it was an addition. Somebody just added it to the calendar. So you've got these tensions, but still in Northern Africa, you've got this speaking now of certain dates. In the East, January 6th, even today, the Orthodox celebrate Christmas on January 6th. But January 6th for the Easterners was a comprehensive date. It wasn't just when the Magi came and when Jesus was born. January 6th stood as the date when the whole shebang was celebrated. What we would call Christmas and Epiphany and so on. All right? So it wasn't separated January 6th back then. Now, 12 days after January 6th, the East celebrates Epiphany. But that was a historical development. So, we've got two theories. One more popular and one more scholarly. And most of us have heard about the popular interpretation. And that has to do with pagan feasts. Did Christianity take over pagan feasts to celebrate? There's still debate about that. But the first theory is that Christmas was borrowed from pagan celebrations. And we're still talking about celebrations. Okay? Now, the Romans had three interesting celebrations. All right? First one is the Saturnalia, the god Saturn. And it took place, what we would say, in around the solstice. All right? And Saturn was the god of agriculture. Okay, so this feast became absolutely raucous. All right, it was the time of year, the animals had been slaughtered, so the farmers wouldn't have to feed the animals during the winter. All right, and everything got topsy-turvy. The servants became rulers, the kids became what kids probably are today, but back then, you know, they took over for the parents and all of that. It was a crazy feast. At the same time, there comes now into play a feast for the Juvenalia, or it was a children's feast. And the children would go around and they would be asking for money from the rich people, and if the rich people didn't fork up, it was kind of like trick-or-treat type of thing, all right? And then there was associated, and this is the important one, a feast called Mithras. And what that was a feast that celebrated the unconquerable or the unconquered sun, S-U-N. Okay? That was called the feast, the Mithras was the original name for it. But it was the birth of Sol Invictus, the unconquerable sun. Some say that Christmas was a spin-off from these solar festivals. Everything centered around the sun. Now you understand why, because the celebrations came at a time where the days started to become longer. So the sun was in the process of taking over. All right? That's what the great solstice celebration is in the winter. The days, the sun is getting brighter, and the days are getting longer. Celebration of the sun. And some say that the Christians then adopted these feasts throughout the Roman world. However, the problem is that we find no mention of that in early Christian writings. But interestingly enough, there is a connection that some found back then between Christ as the true Son, S-U-N, who outshone the pagan gods. But the early Christians saw that more as not as a feast to celebrate, but kind of as a natural proof that God gave us that to show that Christ as the new Son would overcome the pagan gods. Right? But that was nothing set in stone yet. Jumping to the 12th century, we'll come back. There's the first suggestion of Jesus' birth as a deliberately set at the time of pagan feasts. Okay? And I think that's what most of us have kind of grown up with. That the church has a tendency to take pagan feasts and substitute religious feasts on top of them. Those who are familiar with Catholic Saint Joseph. All right? One of the examples, much later on in the 20th century, was that St. Joseph's feast was usually celebrated on March 19th. But May 1st, being May Day in the communist countries, all right, what the church did was they made the feast on May 1st, made the feast of St. Joseph the Worker. So it would coincide with the feast, the May Day feast of the workers in communist countries. That's just a simple example. Christmas was a holiday that was shifted from January 6th to December 25th, so it fell on the same day as the day of the unconquerable sun. Okay? But there are problems with this. Now, if you realize that in the 200s, the Christians were not too anxious to compare or to use pagan feasts. Why not? Because they were being persecuted. They were being persecuted pretty much until the year 312. So there was this tendency, don't try to explain too much, because the early Christians would have been very uncomfortable in substituting the Christian feasts to the pagan feast while they were being persecuted. All right? So that's a problem with that theory. And as we'll see at the end, when I tie it all up, my basic conclusion is, how do we know that the date was December 25th? And the answer is, we don't. There is nothing firmly set. But the history is and then we're coming to the second theory, which is where our Jewish brethren have an idea in their Talmud, which I'll look at in a moment, of helping us to somehow coordinate in Christianity what the days of Christmas celebrate. The first recorded date of Christmas being celebrated is in the year 336, and in the year 350, that's the date when the church officially declared December 25th as Christmas. Pope Julius I. All right? And it wasn't declared a national feast in the United States until 1870, just so that we know.